This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Barry Colfer, and I'm the Director of Research here at the Institute of International and European Affairs. A very warm welcome to those of you who are with us here in central Dublin, and a warm hello to those who are joining us online. We're here to learn about living and working in Europe, challenges and opportunities for Europe's social agenda, and other things. So Europe's world of work is changing, shaped by factors like AI, hybrid work, new forms of work, and a renewed focus on job quality and flexibility. Today we're asking, how can Europe's social agenda respond to ensure competitiveness, fairness, inclusion, and other factors? This panel debate, which we're really happy to be co-organising with both the IIEA and our colleagues at Eurofound. We should do this much more often. It'll cover themes such as working conditions and job quality, telework, employment trends, AI in the workplace, and the rising cost of living and housing. And our expert panellists will also consider how the EU can foster, as mentioned, competitiveness, inclusion, social convergence, and other pressing issues. So, as those who are here will know, Eurofound is an agency of the EU established in 1975, so it marks its 50th anniversary this year. A very happy birthday. Eurofound manage research, they gather data and information, and they communicate all these findings with a view to helping to improve living and working conditions across the European Union. In many ways, for me at least, Eurofound captures almost better than any other organisation or agency the very essence of the European social model, the common values of Articles 2 and 3, human dignity, democracy, equality, sustainable development, social justice, social cohesion, the social market economy itself. And I, for one, sleep better at night knowing that there's a crowd of talented researchers out in Loughlinstown who are dedicated to thinking and working about these really important things, because it is really important work. And personally, I spend a lot of time with Eurofound stuff over the years, and it got me out of many scrapes writing my PhD and other things. So it's just really good to be amplifying a little bit the important work that you guys do at this session this afternoon. So we're going to hear from three expert presenters, and I'm going to introduce them each in a moment. But just to get through the T's and C's as ever, there's going to be the questions and answers after the presentations. Those in the room, please participate in the conventional way with your hands. Those online, you can just use the Q&A function. The discussion is going to be on the record, and it will be recorded and circulated as a podcast on our website afterwards and as a recording. So please do share widely. So now it's just left to me to introduce our speakers. We're going to first of all hear from Tadas Leonchikas, then it's going to be Barbara Gerstenberger and Massimiliano Mascarini. So Tadas has been head of the employment unit at Eurofound since September 2022. Before this, Tadas was a senior research manager in the social policies unit, managing the European Quality of Life Survey and developing Eurofound's survey research. Eurofound is famous for many things, but I would say maybe especially its very high quality and reliable surveys. Since joining Eurofound in 2010, Tadas has worked on various topics, including survey methods, quality of life, social mobility, social inclusion, trust, and housing inadequacies. In his earlier career, Tadas headed up the Institute for Ethnic Studies in Lithuania, where he worked on studies relating to the situation of ethnic minorities, migrants, and other vulnerable groups. As a researcher, he has previously collaborated with the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, the United Nations Development Programme, and the International Organization for Migration. I'm going to quickly introduce the three of you just so that we can have kind of a flowing discussion once we kick off. And our second speaker, as mentioned, is going to be Barbara. Barbara is head of the Working Life Unit at Eurofound. In this role, Barbara coordinates the research teams investigating job quality in Europe based on the European Working Conditions Survey, and has overall responsibility for the European Observatory on Working Life and research into industrial relations in the EU. Barbara joined Eurofound in 2001 and has been a research manager in the European Monitoring Centre on Change and head of communications and coordinator in the Directorate for Products, Information and Communications Unit. Previously, Barbara worked as senior research officer in the European Metal Workers Federation in Brussels, now I believe a part of IG Metall. Our last speaker is going to be Massimiliano. Massimiliano has been head of the social policies unit at Eurofound since October 2019. He joined Eurofound in 2009 as a research manager, designing and coordinating projects on youth employment, NEETs, that's those not in education, employment or training, and their social inclusion, as well as in the labour market participation of women. In 2017, Massimiliano became a senior research manager in the Social Policies Unit, where he spearheaded new research on monitoring convergence in the EU. In addition to his work on the European Quality of Life Survey, Massimiliano also leads the preparation and analysis of the COVID-19 e-surveys. Previously, he was a scientific officer at the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission. What a marvellous series of speakers we have, and what incredible CVs. And it's my pleasure now to hand over to you. I guess you're each going to speak for kind of 7 to 10 minutes or so. Then we'll have a bit of a discussion amongst ourselves before going to the audience. So to you first, please, Tadas.
Thank you, Barry. Thanks for the invitation. On behalf of colleagues, we are happy to be here and discuss on the important subject that you selected for today. Just a quick picture of Eurofound, of our agency in Dublin, which, by the way, will host an open day on the 13th of June. Today we will use an opportunity to give you a flavor of the range of topics, range of issues we are analyzing and researching in this agency. Also for today, you suggested this important topic concerning how the social agenda in EU should develop in the future. From perspective of our agency, which carries out a lot of surveys, data gathering and analysis, we will try to point to pieces of evidence that possibly could inform or incentivize addressing particular subjects in shaping this agenda. And as we know, one of the avenues on how particular countries could do that, could co-shape this agenda, is through the presidencies of the Council. And we have noted the prospect of Ireland coming into this role soon. So with this framing of us not necessarily going into and listing particular policy files for that agenda, we rather will offer a perspective inviting to reflect on key trends, key facts, key concepts that would be important in this process. And as I begin, I want to start with an overview of major trends with regard to structural change in the employment and labor market on a European-wide perspective. One of the key determining factors of how the future will shape is demography. And with regard to two trends, which we see depicted on the graph now, we see them going in two separate directions. On one hand, regardless of very big concerns about crisis that Europe underwent, COVID, uncertainty about post-COVID recovery, major war in Europe's east, and current geopolitical change, uncertainty about the US and so on, the number of jobs and number of people in employment in Europe kept growing. It kept growing steadily, so we can speak about a tendency and trend. And it happened at the same time when a blue line there, the working age population kept shrinking. So potential pool of people who could come, do work, be employed is shrinking. And at the same time, we kept having the rise in employment. So the picture like this suggests that there could be a ceiling we might hit at some point. And that's a major consideration for rethinking on how and whom and on what terms we engage in productive activities in employment. With regard to EU, particularly European Union's social and employment policies, a component of good work, good employment, good working conditions, a component of social dialogue shaping that has always been a strong dimension. There has been also a long-lasting concern about shortcomings, problematic roles in labor market, precarious work, potential polarization. And that has been in the air, that has been in the discourse of policymakers and social partners for quite some time. And for good reasons, there are problems to tackle. But sometimes in a problem-focused discourse, we miss to see the developments that could provide a bit more certainty, that could actually be an acknowledgement of where Europe did well. And I depicted just one potential dimension out of different forms of employment, different status in terms of employment people have, which is a proportion of people in EU workforce that are on permanent full-time employment with permanent contracts. And this, again, for a number of recent years, kept rising. So in the EU broad wide perspective, the change had been in a few percentage points so far, but it does look like a tendency. To understand something like that, we need to understand how we assess, how to judge that development. We also need to broaden up a context a little bit. On one hand, recently, and up till now, we have a changed situation of labor market developments. For long years, we had a preoccupation of social and employment policies on fighting unemployment. And Ireland is no exception, had a particular experience in this regard after the financial crisis more than a decade ago. But in recent years, employment keeps rising, unemployment keeps staying low, and this trend of more and more people joining the labor market is continuing. So it could be, on one hand, that the shortage of labor creates better conditions for the workers to obtain better contracts, better employment conditions, and so on. On the other hand, I wouldn't dismiss, and I would offer a topic for reflection. Maybe it also is a piece of evidence that European social model works, that the incentives taken at European level by European institutions are beginning to produce a desirable outcome. And it's not a small thing in a climate that changes in many countries now with regard whether or not EU is adding value, where skepticism sometimes rises, not always on any good base of evidence. Having seen a European trend, we will not always see same perception in different countries of that broad trend. And of course, our experiences are shaped by how different countries develop. That has been a development I showed before, don't get lost in the graph, for the European average. But for some countries, the direction of change has been different for a minority of them. So we shouldn't ignore, we should respect that not everybody has the same experience all the time. And we have to distinguish where the experience is nationally specific and where it is part of a broad development. A couple more points, if I still have time. To also understand the structural change, the major change our economies and societies undergo, and in my case, with regard to employment, we also need to take account of sectoral and occupational change. So in this graph, and I'm sure the materials, slides all of us have brought up will be shared and available for closer study. In this graph, colleagues in Employment Union have depicted a sectoral change, and it shows the last changes over the last 3 years with regard to people in particular major sectors in our economies, either numbering up, employment rising, or decreasing. By and large, a European trend is towards this so-called service transition. Manufacturing is nearly everywhere contracting to some degree. It's a long-term trend. And employment in public and private services is increasing. It is a trend seen globally as economies advance, but in Europe's context, it also brings up a question to what extent it is providing a sustainable basis for economic competitiveness. To what extent contraction of manufacturing provide sufficient base for strategic autonomy and for industrial power in Europe in context of global challenges. So these couple of trends. The size of the bar overall, and Ireland has a circle around, is pointed out in this graph, demonstrates the extent of the change over time. So the longer the bar, the more people have moved from the sector they work, the more people have entered or left employment. And Ireland, you see, is on the side of countries which have experienced larger changes. And this is what we know about this country. It is dynamic, but managing this dynamic sometimes can be a challenge, and in particular for employment and social policies to facilitate labor market transitions. We know also a challenge not only for people who work, to support them in their work, in the work-life balance and so on, but also a challenge for societies and economies to bring more people to productive activities, to change the situation so that inactivity levels decrease. And I believe my colleagues will allude to some factors that also affect that. By the way, just wanted to point out another particular development with regard to construction sector. Whereas public and private services rise across the board, that's a universal, broad, long-lasting trend. Contraction of employment or growth of employment in construction is very different. Ireland is a country which has, as we know, a big housing problem. And we'll hear more about from colleagues from Massey. Yeah, so the answer was difficult to find for many policymakers, but researchers as well, on where the secret is in addressing that. And yep.
There's one obvious outlier there.
Yep.
A country at the extreme. Can you just meditate a bit on why is there such a...
Yeah, the outlier we see is Romania, which underwent very big contraction in agricultural employment. And they started from low base, very fragmented, low use of technologies, not productive agriculture, so they had a big contraction. We can discuss that. On our way here, we had a discussion, a chat about how to approach the contraction of agriculture, which Ireland also experiences. That's a more or less universal trend. Productivity in agriculture has been rising. And we don't necessarily need as many people to produce food we need as it used to be in the past. A lot of that is an industry that contributes to international trade. A lot of food produced is traded. And we heard about that being a concern in yesterday's demonstration of Irish Farmer Association in Dublin Centre. So that's about the outlier. But for construction, I'd say another piece of information interesting for reflection is with regard to housing problem, and we'll hear again from colleagues, how deepening, how challenging it becomes for many, many countries and many, many people across Europe. We see the following developments. You know that the recent commission, the current commission, has a particular role, a particular commissioner appointed for energy and housing. So that's a big step in the broad European agenda setting, if you will, referring to the topic of the day. But at some point, we also have to come to considering how we address housing as a challenge in general, and when we will come to directly address the supply, the construction of housing stock, especially in countries like Ireland, which have the luxury of population growth. Many have demographic contraction, but here we have a different thing. So I'll try to move on towards wrapping up, quickly pointing at a couple of trends. Service transition of the economy as a whole, with regard to individuals, a trend of professionalization, increasing level of education and skills of our workers. And that also brings us to one of the most curious questions of the day. What role the new technologies, the rise of artificial intelligence will bring. Oftentimes in the field of labor economics, economics in general, a popular consideration is around impact on jobs. There is this apocalyptic vision that forthcoming technologies and nowadays AI will eliminate a need for many jobs. So far, we don't see much evidence for that. We rather see fragments of evidence emerging about augmentation of jobs. And you'll hear from colleagues as well that it is a concern. It is a concern with regard to potential implications for the world of work, but also much beyond for society at large. The last piece, the last chart I'm showing are a recent data about proportion of companies in Europe by country that adopt some sort of AI systems or tools. If there was slow take-up, a concern by some European policymakers of these new technologies for some time, in the last year or so, we see fast advancement, fast adoption. Whether those tools make a difference is for debate. On which dimensions they make a difference is also important to begin distinguishing. It's not about all or nothing. It's about where and how the technology can make a difference. It will need to make a difference for individuals, but also for Europe's competitiveness as a whole. I'll stop here and
thank you, Taras.
Great stuff. Pass on the floor now to Barbara to address.
Phenomenal. Barbara, please.
And I'll pick up where Taras left off. The last chart you saw, the increasing use of artificial intelligence in companies in the workplace, is the latest demonstration of how technological change impacts on work. And we've seen other changes in this area of technological change before. Then we have, Taras mentioned it, we have demographic change. We have not yet mentioned, but of course it's also an important driver of change, climate change, the move to a decarbonized economy. And then geopolitical tensions, reglobalization, deglobalization, trade wars. So all these are drivers which will have an impact on the labor market. Jobs will be created, jobs will be lost, and the question is, will new jobs be good jobs? But very much related to this is also the question, is the workforce ready for that change? Are they ready for the adaptation that is required to support and cope with this change? And I think it's intuitive to say and think, and actually research can prove that point, that in order to cope with these changes, we need a skilled, an engaged, and a motivated workforce. How do you get that? Through and in good quality jobs. And interestingly enough, the Commission's competitiveness compass that they published in January takes up that point. Quality jobs are mentioned as a prerequisite for greater labor force participation and increased productivity. So it is really the basis for Europe's competitiveness. Now, next question, what makes a good job a good job? And that's something that Eurofound in its 50 years of existence has pondered and researched quite a bit. So the first point that I need to make, that probably it's clear to everyone in the room, but we need to first establish that job quality is obviously multidimensional. If I ask in the room what makes your job a good job, yes, some of you will say, well, pay, and pay is actually a good proxy for job quality, but there are other elements clearly that also impact on job quality. So we have developed for those 7 dimensions that we distinguish in the conceptual framework of Eurofound on job quality. For those 7 dimensions, we have created indices that we measure through the European Working Conditions surveys, through questions in the European Working Conditions survey. Now, again, important to understand, what we're looking here at is the level of the job. We're interested how workers perform their work and what are the characteristics of these work situations and working conditions. We're also trying to capture objective attributes to the job. So ideally something that a third party can measure as well. So we're not asking how satisfied are you with your job, but we would be asking, do you have to lift heavy loads or people? Are you exposed to emotional demands in your job? So things that can be objectively established. So that is the basis for establishing job quality and for measuring it, and for then also measuring progress in those 7 dimensions of job quality. Now, what is interesting to see is that these indices, these 7 dimensions of job quality, are not systematically correlated. That's why we don't compile them and put them together in one job quality index that would end with just one figure: good job, medium quality job, poor quality job. So they're not systematically correlated. But we did an interesting exercise through a latent class analysis to see, do they group together in certain ways? And as you can see here, they do. So some jobs are characterized by high scores for some job quality indices, and positive would be blue and to the right, combined with other elements of job quality that are not so good. So we tried to find nice labels for those 5 job profiles that we can distinguish: high flying, smooth running, etc. Don't get hung up on the labeling, but it is interesting to see that we have these 5 rather distinct job quality profiles if we look at jobs overall in the European Union. Now, the high-flying jobs are obviously good quality jobs, but there are even those not perfect jobs. As you can see, when it comes to work intensity, they are not perfect because work intensity is quite high in these jobs. And when it comes to working time quality, they are also not perfect because very often they come with long working hours per day, per week, etc. Think about whether maybe your own job might fall into this category. So the interesting thing here is that whereas it is rather easy to identify a poor quality job where all the dimensions are negative, it's very difficult to say, and this is clearly a perfect job. For all those jobs, there is room for improvement, which is also, you could argue, a positive thing, the fact that job quality is multidimensional, because it gives policymakers at different levels, the social partners, companies, a lot of tools and levers that they can turn and manipulate in order to improve job quality. Just imagine an initiative that addresses work intensity. And you can see on the little pie chart there, 21% of jobs in Europe in 2015 were in the high-flying category, 25% in the smooth-running category. So if you look at where work intensity is a problem, and you imagine an initiative that addresses issues around work intensity, you can see how many jobs potentially you could improve by addressing this particular aspect of job quality. So a lot of possibility for intervention. What I also want to point out is, coming back to this, we need an engaged, a skilled, or ready to learn and upskill workforce, and we need a workforce which is ready to enter the labor market and to stay in employment for longer. And there, the Working Conditions Survey, the European Working Conditions Survey, also asks the question about the level of engagement, about possibilities for learning new skills, not only through training, but also through on-the-job learning. And there you can see the clear link between these outcomes and job quality. In a job, where you have good quality in these dimensions, you will find a more engaged workforce, workers who say they are enthusiastic about their job, full of energy. Time flies when I am at work. If you look at responses, you will see that there is a clear link with good job quality in those dimensions. And interesting also for the question on learning and upskilling. There, it makes a very big difference to what extent in the area of skills and discretion you experience good quality. How much influence does your company allow you to take on your own job, but also participation in organizational decision-making? Again, statistically speaking, you can see a link between companies who offer this kind of participation and then also offering possibilities for training and on-the-job learning. So again, we have the link between job quality and good outcomes in terms of readiness to learn and upskill. The last point, encouraging more people to enter the labor market and to stay in the labor market for longer. We did an analysis looking at a number of occupations that are experiencing persisting labor shortages. We're talking about nurses, we're talking about carers, cooks, cleaners, etc. If you look at job quality in those occupations, and again, at the European level with the European Working Conditions Survey, we can do this, you can see a higher, above than average share of poor quality jobs in those occupations. So yes, labor shortages can be the result of skills shortages, but they can also very clearly be the result of poor quality jobs on offer. I will go back to the topic of technological change and AI use. I thought it was quite interesting. I don't know whether you remember the graph that Taras showed as regards use of AI by companies based on information collected from companies through a Eurostat survey. This is the result from last year's, the 2024 European Working Conditions Survey. And you can see here around 12% EU average, very much on the right there, around 12% of workers say that they use generative AI tools in their work. But just like with uptake in companies, you can see the enormous spread and the differences between the member states, and exactly the same countries that you see here on the left hand were the ones that showed up in Taras's graph on the left hand, and it's the same for the right hand, for the right side. So there are enormous differences between the member states. And also, and we're just starting to analyze this data, so I thought that was a very interesting result. It's a male thing. It's a young people's thing, more young people, younger people than older people, older workers use AI at the workplace. But look at the differences between women on the left-hand side and men at the right-hand side. So I think that needs to be analyzed in much more detail, but I thought that was an interesting result that I wanted to share. And my last point is this one here. That's also interesting because there is this fear that not only the use of AI, that's very recent, but technological change, use of technology in general will lead to a loss of a lot of tasks and therefore a loss of jobs. If you look at this, more workers say that actually use of technology has led to an increase in tasks, new tasks being added, than workers who say tasks have been removed from their jobs. And on the very right-hand side, there is information about whether the use of technology has allowed for more interaction with colleagues. And again, a fear that use of technology leads to isolation at the workplace. Not really, it seems. A high share of workers, more than 50%, say actually the use of technology has led to an increase of contacts and interaction with colleagues. So all of this, well, the last three graphs that I showed you is from the new data set, the 2024 data set. Still a lot of work to be done to analyze this in more detail, but I think as a little taster, that was nice to share this already. Marci.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, actually. And we move now with me from the challenges of workers to the challenges of our citizens and our societies. And I will take from where Barbara left, so digitalization and artificial intelligence. And we know these are things that affect all of us and all part of our lives. And one important thing that is affecting us is social media. I mean, social media is that tool that allows us to be in contact with everyone, but is also the tool from which we can have access to information that are not controlled, that are sometimes fake and misinformation. And the algorithm that can be used actually in a way that we don't notice in order to build echo chambers around us and to shape our perceptions and to shape our political consensus. So we investigated social media and we found that 1 out of 3 European citizens basically, so the 30% consume their news online. So social media is the main source of information of 1/3 of our citizens. And this share increased to more than 40% for those who are young, that have as main source of information Instagram and TikTok, where everyone can produce information based also on imagination, as we can see. The thing is that these basically can basically have, as I said, a strong impact in shaping our perception on our life and our consensus. As if we see some association, actually, we see that those who used social media as main source of information are characterized by being those who have the lowest trust in institutions, the lower satisfaction in how democracy works. They had the highest propensity to be vaccine hesitant during COVID-19. And nowadays, they are those who basically show the lowest level of support to Ukraine, especially humanitarian aid to Ukraine, but also housing to Ukrainian refugees, as well as to military support. So there is clearly an association of this. Now, clearly, it's not that people just at one point wake up and say, okay, from today I will have my information on social media and I will turn as an extremism. Actually, this is something that does not happen overnight. Clearly, if people turn on having their news on social media, it's because there is a disaffection toward traditional media, with this perception of not being listened, not being seen by the traditional media, and the problem of our citizens not being seen by traditional media and our governments. So there is a problem of recognition of the instances of many citizens, but also a problem of vulnerability, of economic vulnerability that can bring to have a lower trust in our governments. And here, if you see, on the other hand, the main indicators of the European Pillar of Social Rights, for example, the at risk of poverty, what we see is in the last 10 years, there has been a reduction of poverty in Europe. Not strong, but there has been a reduction of poverty in Europe. But if we go to the indicators that are more related to perception, as the difficulties to make ends meet, or to the risk of going in areas, we see that these numbers increase and increased a lot. So basically, the 40% of Europeans believed to do not making ends meet, and this number is higher for Ireland, actually, for example, 47%, while the overall poverty rate of Ireland is lower than the European average. In this case, is higher. And there is a huge fragmentation of this data, of the perception and the living in poverty. It depends really on a lot of factors, but is age, is gender, is educational level, is the place where you live, that basically create a very different narrative that go beyond the average that then is used to monitor poverty in a country. What we see, for example, is that if we consider being in areas, we see that these rates in Europe, on the average is 9%, but this varies from 2% of older people with a tertiary educational level to more than 40% of prime age group with a low educational level. So, you know, from 2% to 40% is 20%, is 20 times higher, and is a very different living condition experience that bring you actually to understand the processes that happens around you in very different way. And then there are the surge of new form of poverty, actually, and these are, for example, energy poverty. And here we see that in Europe, around 18% of citizens in 2024, so 2 years after the energy crisis that started with the war in Ukraine, still is at risk of not paying the energy bill at the end of the month. And this is still a huge number. And if we see again, there is this different distribution among our citizens. We just took age here, and we see that those who are prime age are more at risk of not making ends this type of meet, also due to the presence of dependable person and so on. But this also shows that if we consider poverty in the last 10 years and we divide among the different categories, for some people it has decreased, but for others it has increased. But especially the distance between the social group has increased, and so we are more at risk of fragmentations of our society that a bit explain how people is now unfortunately moving towards a more populistic political views. And then the surge also of other forms of poverty, as for example the unmet medical needs. We see that 1/4 of those who participated to our surveys has unmet medical needs, actually, and these are especially exam with specialists at the hospital or mental health care or dental health care. These are quite large numbers that clearly varies in the different countries. But what we see in all countries, there is a pattern of increase of these unmet medical needs that is focused on certain parts of our population. And then there is the main problem that if we see around is affecting our society. And this problem is housing. I was reading yesterday on the Irish Times that for the first time the average rent in Ireland was above 2,000 euros, actually. But this is not just an Irish problem. It's the problem of all Western societies. This is Italy, for example, with Florence, that is my city, which is the least affordable city in Italy for renting, because the rents are in proportion the highest and the most expensive. But the same is Madrid, for example. The same are all big cities, are all capital cities in the West and in the Eastern European countries that were the rent and the price of property has increased as such that now having access to affordable housing is a luxury. But having housing problems is not just having problem to pay. It has a lot of consequences. We talk about the consequence of housing exclusion, so not having access to housing, or insecurity of cost, or inadequacy. So there are really profound consequences. And one of these is that the consequence of housing exclusion is not just homelessness, that is clearly a very important consequence, but is also the delayed nest living. What we are seeing in Europe in the last 10 years is that the average age or the median age to which young people leave a parental home is increased. In the last 12 years, it had increased in Europe of 2 years. So firstly, the half of young European left parental home at the age of 26, and now is 28. And this is due also to the difficulties in accessing housing. And this has, the living parental home is the first step for a full transition to adulthood. And this has implication also in the decision of entering in parenthood, because if we delay the first transition, we also delay also the others. But we know that at some point, the transition to parenthood cannot be done anymore. And then the cost, clearly. I mean, cost has affected a lot of people, much more than the official indicator says, actually, because it's just an average. But if we go to the different groups, we see that single parents, single person, especially women, they are more at risk of having housing costs that are unaffordable. Now, we made up pictures of problems, actually, but this has then an implications that we see from the data that we are more and more a pessimistic Europe. And this actually is something that should be a source of concern much more than it is. Because, perceiving headwinds as insurmountable and giving up of the idea of progress is a big risk in moments of geopolitical turmoil. Because this widespread discontent is basically a fertile ground for populistic forces that propose authoritarian tendencies. And social media, the one that I mentioned at the beginning, have the power to amplify this perception, and basically it's like throwing petrol on fire. So fostering and constructing a more social Europe is vital for the stability and the future of prosperity. And in this, in fact, there is the future of social agenda. We are in a moment of challenges, of geopolitical challenges, or challenges brought from the digital and the green transition. And sometimes the solution that we hear is that basically let's cut the social agenda in order to finance other type of expenditure. These are risks. These happened already in 2008 in certain extent. And the result is that with the cut of the social agenda and the social expenditure, the seeds of social unfairness were spread that then brought the rise of populism and extremism in Europe. So we should be very careful on that. And thanks a lot for your attention.
If you can just thank the speakers. I really enjoyed that, and I'm still, my breath is taken by just the scale of your activities, and just again how important it is. All these themes, poverty, housing, democracy, employment. It's getting at the heart of what the whole European project is about for me, again, just to reiterate that point.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.